This is the Casual Temple Podcast, and you are listening to episode number 1, and I'm your host, Marilee Duffy. My mission with the Casual Temple Podcast is to introduce the world to different ways of developing a relationship with spirit. We will hear from everyday people about their magical practices, psychic phenomenon, energy healing, as well as hear about the amazing mystical and paranormal experiences. This week, my guest is Emma Devan, who joins the podcast to talk about her spiritual journey, as well as her experience as a psychic and healing instructor here in Seattle, Washington. We also get into discussing remote viewing and liminal states. Thank you all for joining us here at Casual Temple. Today's guest is Emma Devan. Emma is a psychic and healing instructor here in Seattle, Washington. Emma, thank you for being my first guest and willing to talk about your relationship with spirit.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, thank you. So I guess just to kind of get the ball rolling, and I know a little bit about sort of what your spiritual path has looked like, and I know you've been interested in a lot of different things and have tried a lot of different things, and but what was sort of like either your first spiritual event or modality that you learned, wherever you want to start?
Yeah, great question. When you ask that question, there is one thing that often pops into my mind when I first think I felt some connection to something greater, and I knew something that the average child wouldn't know. And I was about 8 years old. That's a guess. So somewhere around then, and I remember being at home and just understanding that the earth was just this little tiny organism inside of something much larger, and that there were these much larger beings. I didn't know what they were. I was just a child, but I could feel it. I knew it was true. There were these much larger beings that sort of peer down at the earth the way a human might like look into through a microscope at microscopic organisms. And I knew that. And I've always just known and felt things in various ways, in various degrees throughout all of my life up until the present. But when you ask the question, what did I first hit with, or what did I first ping with? When I was probably around 14 years old, I stumbled upon the writings of Edgar Cayce. And that was really what got the ball rolling for me. And I didn't know what it was that clicked with me, but I could feel that he was onto something. And from there, the rest is history. I just kept going and finding and discovering more and more. And what ultimately really pinged for me was The Seth Material by Jane Roberts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some channeling and The Sleeping Prophet. Those are two good good places to start.
Absolutely.
So what would you say was your own sort of, from kicking off from Edgar Cayce and the Seth Material, like how did you go about this, like exploring for yourself? Because I know that you're very much into actually doing the practice or doing practices.
That's a really great question, because in a way I would think that I'm somewhat of a late bloomer to the actual practice. I was always heavily concentrated on the theory early in my life, early through my 20s and my 30s, living life, doing what you're supposed to do out in the world. But about 12, 13 years ago, I realized that for all of the theoretical study and all of the efforts in that way, I really wasn't making it work for me. And that's when I got really busy and said, okay, I need to go outside of what I've already learned. And I stumbled upon Sonia Choquette, who's a well-known. And it was her work that was more the practical application side. And once I got started with that, she used to travel and teach. And once I got started with her program of really accessing in a practical, effective way the inner knowledge that you had to make it work for you, then it blew wide open. And then it was just sorting through and doing a lot of the self-work and self-exploration and the expansion of understanding and ability. Once the ball got rolling, it just exponentially kicked off.
Would you say that because I'm sort of familiar with Sonia Choquette as well, would you say that the actual practicality of you like focusing on something and it showing up, was that where you were like, oh, Oh, I
Yeah,
can make
it
this
was
work.
actually more about answering questions and coming to the understanding of what was creating things to be the way they were. So
Hmm.
it was less about, trying to create new experiences in my life, but to actually really understand what was going on underneath
Hmm.
and to be able to dialogue and access, the inner self, inner consciousness or greater consciousness and get some real useful answers. So it was like, well, this can't just be just theoretical
Mm.
study, which I can quote, no end of tomorrow. But what do you actually do with all that knowledge? And
Hmm.
that was really, really what got that started for me. And having real world, meaningful, practical situations really is what helped grow.
Hmm. Sonia, and then let's see. Okay, so your three teachers at this point that I've heard is like Sonia, and then Edgar Casey and the Seth material.
Mhm.
So from there, with all the stuff that you've discovered uh, in your path, like what drove you to kind of more into sort of the healing space that you're kind of in now? Because I know you've talked a little bit
Yeah.
about that before.
Yeah, it was actually a sudden downturn in my own health,
Mm,
and I had a period for about 2 or 3 years where my own health just imploded. That I began to develop all kinds of difficulties and showed symptoms that of various ailments, some of which ran in the family.
hmm.
And because I was so well established and so took to heart the principles in the Seth material of you create your own reality, it's not, that there's something about this that you do have command over. I
Hmm.
really took that to heart and I really dug very deep and discovered what was really truly going on that was causing a variety of issues and ailments. Did the belief work, did the emotional sorting, did actually develop a new way of or a new way to me at least of actually healing the body and coming to well-being and solving things.
Hmm.
And because I did that, one, it affirmed that yes, you can do it. Two, it did reveal just how much your beliefs and your emotions and all of the inner psyche and the inner consciousness really do inform the body and affect the body. And from there, it became about 2.5, 3 years of just pulling myself out of what was a real serious decline in health, very serious decline. I was losing my eyesight,
Mm,
arthritis systems. I was showing symptoms of significant deterioration. And because I was so successful with that, um, I eventually uh, honed that process to myself. And a friend of mine came to me, this was some years ago, and she was having some jaw pain.
mm.
And her doctor had recommended to her that she go get surgery. I said, wait, time out. Now, she's not informed like some of your listeners might be. She's more in the average camp of deal with things a different way. I said,
Hmm.
well, stop here before you do it. Let's try something. Doesn't cost anything. Let's try something. And I taught her some of the techniques that I had figured out for myself. And she was good, good friend. She went along. Maybe she just humored me, but she did it. She really took a look at the beliefs and the emotions and the things that were going on for her life and was
Hmm.
able to make a connection with the pain that she was experiencing in her jaw. And it took about 2 or 3 months for her to work through it, but she
Hmm.
was able to not have the surgery and to clear up the issue. And she was successful with it.
Oh, wow.
And that taught me that that is teachable, that
Hmm.
it is teachable. And that's really where my focus and my preference is now in doing healing work with individuals is to not make it a passive receiving experience only for them, but
Hmm.
to make it also educational, to give
Yeah.
them the tools so that they can go home and do their own self-work for their own well-being.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely think that you're definitely ahead of a lot of people because I think that's where the direction is going
It
generally
has to go.
now. Yeah.
It
Because
has to.
like you're right, I believe too that people they're like the best person to really handle their own issues. Like they can be taught the methods, but yeah, I agree with that.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see. Gosh, I had a question regarding the I guess I already sort of answered it. But anyway, so with these healing modalities that you've sort of learned, oh, here's my question. So your healing modalities, what do you think about, because I this is something I've been sort of thinking about on my own, but sort of the material world medicine of like going to a doctor, da 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 da, and then sort of the energetic piece that we're kind of talking about, sort of the underlying thing. How do you think those work together, if they do? Or how do you think that goes together?
Yeah, it's I do think that that is in fluctuation and will only become more fluid and flexible as different trends take over, different values and different preferences take over, and as those who are knowledgeable and skilled and effective in approaching health and well-being and promoting well-being through other methods than the allopathic system, or Western medicine, using that term very broadly, that they may or may not work together. I find tremendous respect for allopathic medicine when it comes to piecing back together broken bodies. So if you break a bone, for heaven's sakes, go get it fixed. But you can still work with yourself at an energetic level, or the inner energetic flow of the body, to promote that healing quite a bit faster. Where I find that there's a more probable divergence between allopathic and what we'll just call energy medicine or energy healing has more to do with longstanding repeating patterns and issues of difficulty. And from the camp that I come from, that those are pretty much universally rooted in ideas, attitudes, emotions of the individual, and in some cases in misusage. So if there's a constant strain on a part of the body, then there can be overuse or misuse or coordination issues. And in that case, things like physical therapy, I think, can work very beautifully. But I've seen it happen many times, and I've experienced this personally myself, where once you find the actual core issue, literally the physical expression of the issue evaporates within days. And I'm talking about things you may have had for years. And it sounds miraculous, but it's happened to me, and I know that it's happened to others. So it is possible. It's just about continuing to learn, because it is I think, a developing field. It's an emerging field. So we're all still learning and improving, and just think of where it will be in 50 or 100 years.
Yeah. So something I was thinking about, because I've also, as you have, we've worked with people. What do you think about having either the person not believing or having the belief that whatever you're working with them on will work or not work?
Yeah, so there's a great question, because that, I would say, applies to any modality. So if you look at allopathic medicine and what they're, or any, whether I'm a firm believer in traditional Chinese medicine, for example, I can recommend that without reservations. And there are other Ayurvedic medicine, there's naturopathy, there's so many different ways to approach something. Ultimately, it's the willingness of the patient to create that change in themselves that will make that work or not work. But also, does it last? Yeah, does it last? And so that's where, again, I do think that allopathic medicine is very successful when it comes to mending broken bones and repairing damage and things like that, because most people don't want to maintain that. Most people don't want to maintain a broken bone. They want it to heal. But in surprising cases, if you look, and I'm sure you've probably experienced this in your own practice as well, if you look really closely at what's bothering someone, sometimes they don't want to face it, right? They may not be ready to do that. And in which case, then my personal choice then in working with an individual is to not attempt to solve the physical problem, but to pivot over to, let's solve why you don't want to face this. So it's always about finding what I call that pivot point of what they're ready to do. And it
Mm-hmm.
might be, I'm just ready to get over my reluctance to deal with this. And
Right.
then you just find that opening, that window of opportunity, and that's your route in.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. That was very eloquently explained. Uh, that was very helpful for me to hear that.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, let's see. So I know that you have looked at a lot of different modalities and a lot of different spaces. Um, what are what are some of the more surprising moments that kind of shaped how your current practice is?
Yeah, so I took to think about this because it's sometimes what would surprise one person would not, another
Mhm.
person would just, well, that's just how it works.
Right.
But one of my kind of mind-blowing kaboom moments has to do with the relationship between physical experience and inner dream life.
Mm,
So I do teach purposeful dreaming and interpretation, which is pretty well substantiated, or at least there's a lot of theory in the Seth material about the nature of dreams and the purpose of dreams. And I did connect the dots between the information that I received directly from within and my own experience. Is it doesn't suddenly just blew my mind one day when I realized that my life is essentially the dream of my inner consciousness.
mm,
And as you know, I'm sure many of your listeners know or realize this as well, that your dreams are often symbolic. They have meaning to them. They represent something. They're not just a fictional story. They have significance to them. And so then I traced that backwards and realized, well, my life is something like a symbolic dream to my inner consciousness. Therefore, I can interpret my life as if it were a dream.
mm,
And now, oh my goodness, I see things so completely different. I see things so completely differently because I realized that, well, if this were a dream, I would be looking at this event that I'm experiencing and interpreting it as I see the connection. I see the
mm,
connection. Yeah, I see why it is that I stumbled upon broken glass one day. I realized that something had been shattered. Now I'm thinking,
mm,
well, okay, if this was in a dream, I would look at this and I say, what was shattered? What was
mm-hmm,
broken that this is a symbol of? But I can do the same thing if I go out into the world and it's like, why is there all this broken glass here? Stop and think about it. It's like I'm having a living dream. So
mm.
it's almost like the opposite end of the spectrum of a lucid dream.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting because I think that is always a struggle either for I think it's a struggle for just people who maybe haven't had any sort of spiritual experiences aren't paying attention to them.
Mhm.
Because I would say that if you look for any sort of dreamlike meaning or symbols just in your regular life, like you'll find them. Um, an example would be my sister and I, when we were in the Philippines, we kept seeing, I think on three different occasions, these atlas moths, which are just enormous. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, there's another one." And I was like, "That's significant. We should log that." So that's interesting that you called that out. And I think you even sort of mentioned like what is the significance to you? Like your talk about the shattered glass, like what
Mhm.
is shattered? And kind of like
Right, what
reflect
is
on that.
shattered? Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. So that is part of the continuing expansion or unfolding of my own understanding is eh, coming to see like the continuous flow of all of the worlds that we exist in. So we
Mm,
have our physical reality, we have the dream world that we have, and sometimes you remember, and sometimes you become awake in the dream, and then it's somewhat different, and you can do things. And it's all this kind of interconnected flow with each other. And I've come to really understand and really believe that they're not that discrete. They
mm,
kind of bleed into each other all of the time. Sort of like you might get a message, someone might call or text you from their way over on another part of the world, but their communication intersects, it comes into and makes itself known in where you are. Same
mm,
thing happens with all of these different kind of levels of our own experience from the dreaming world out to the physical.
mm. Cool. I like that explanation. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, So kind of pivoting a little bit, but not too much.
Mhm.
So in your spiritual journey, would you say there were some pitfalls or any sort of either in human form, meaning there was like the way I'm thinking of this is like there was a teacher you were kind of interested in, and then you were like, no, after a time. Or if it was like a circumstance, like you were in a like a particular, let's say, like a meditation class, but that didn't work out either.
Yeah.
And any sort of advice about any of those situations that you may have.
I do. It's a wonderful thing to bring this up because it really is worth understanding that in the global culture that we have today, that this is all a churning pot of various influences in terms of understanding the inner realities or the spiritual world or your own psycho spiritual physical being. It's still a work in progress, and right now my observation is that there's a lot of tributaries from all of these different cultures that are kind of getting mishmashed together. And so it's a real hodgepodge, at least in I think in the United States, of a mixture where you might get this and you might get that and you might get something else and you don't know what you're going to get. So a pitfall, and I think it's a really important one to bring up, is that when it comes to seeking learning and education or training experience with a teacher, it can be hit and miss, frankly. It can be really hit and miss.
Mm-hmm.
And to recommend that take everything with a grain of salt, but really look around if you're wanting to develop certain skills, abilities, or practice things with a cohort, with colleagues. Uh, Always be aware that what you're hearing is not necessarily the whole story and that there can be another way. And if a student or a learner comes into a program, whether it's a class, a workshop, a very long intensive, a week-long retreat or whatever, always trust yourself to know when it doesn't feel right for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this doesn't feel right for me. I don't click with this. It doesn't resonate with me. And be willing to just set that aside and trust your own inner self to say, is there another way that I can do this? So I do find that the educational side of it is actually very hit and miss. And then when it comes to actually going deep with the work, and I consider psychic learning really just to be the cultivation of our own native abilities. And we all have that, but
Mm-hmm.
we're all at very different stages of it. Some people are just getting started. Some people haven't started. Some people are, world-class mediums who can, do amazing things to really change the world by what they can do. Um, but I have found that there's no distinction between the effects of doing psychic development on what it means to you as a spiritual being and what it means to you as an emotional being and what it means to you as a physical being and what it means to you in a more material sense. So when you change one thing, it can disrupt and change a whole lot else too.
Mm-hmm.
And just be aware of that and prepared for that the discoveries that you might make, a person might make in one area, can have a domino effect, that it can affect them in many new ways. And a pitfall is also that if you do not have a really good understanding about some of the things that you might experience, people can feel very insecure with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a international student from Chile who had to reach out to me because she was feeling very distressed and very discouraged and didn't understand what was happening to her. She was getting all of this information and having all of these experiences. And because she didn't have already a good foundation, whether it was in theory or practice or guidance, she found it very straining. She just didn't know what to do, didn't trust it. And so she reached out, fortunately, and was able to chat with people who were more experienced. But that framework of reference to understand what's happening to you and to know that that's okay if you start to receive more information, really important. And not everyone has that.
What would you, yeah, I do agree with that for sure. how would you say, because what was coming up when you were talking was, okay, so I need to trust my own guidance, like say if I'm working with a teacher or a particular class or whatnot, and take the things I need and, throw everything else out. So, but what if you don't have that really good connection with yourself and you just are like, I don't know what to think, and you get confused? Like how would you sort through that?
Yeah, tough
Hmm.
question, because ultimately I do think that there is a degree of readiness that a
Mm,
person may or may not have. And also that psychic expansion or psychic development of inner, I think in some cases a student maybe is rushed a little bit into doing work with other people or practice work or mediumship when they don't have themselves figured out first.
mm,
And so, for any student who goes into and feels like this isn't right for me, I don't know, I don't trust this, something feels really off, there aren't too many choices I think the person has other than to say, I'm going to leave, step back, and maybe search for something different. I do personally recommend for anyone who's truly a novice, who's really never learned either theory or technique, to get a good foundation in some kind of theory.
hmm.
Get a good foundation, whether you want to study shamanic practice or I'm all about the Seth material, or if you want to study the Kabbalah, or maybe you like some of the Eastern traditions or what have you, get some kind of grounding or some sort of foundation and understanding what you're doing, and then do more of the development practice work after you feel like you're comfortable with the theoretical system upon which it's based.
Mm-hmm.
So some people love shamanic practice, and it's absolutely the right thing for them to do, but it's based on a very particular kind of set of ideas, spirit and nature and guides and all of these other things. But not every system uses that. There are others. So find the system that feels right for you, and then just go with it as far as you can, or far as what you feels right.
Great answer. So I guess for yourself, I know we talked about sort of your energy healing and modalities and your teaching. So, and how do you consider, or how did you understand that you had psychic abilities or psychic powers? Or do you even consider that you have those things or have developed them?
Well, because I've been at this for such a teenager, I've never considered to be anything other than this is what's natural
Mm,
and that everyone does this. But the way I teach psychic development or teach anything in the general field is that psychic development is ultimately learning to do consciously with intent what you are already doing subconsciously, what you're already doing instinctively. So, for example, everyone astral projects at night, whether they remember it or not.
mhm,
But there's a smaller percentage of people who've learned to do that consciously with intent. And everybody picks up information from each other
mhm,
all the time. But it's another level to learn to do that with conscious intent, that you can meet a stranger, sit there for a moment and say, well, I can see that you're contemplating changing your career and you're wanting to move to another city. And they're like, whoa, yeah, how did you know that? Well, there's a technique to that. There's a skill to do that. So
mhm,
ultimately, learning to do with intent consciously what we're already doing subconsciously is really what we're talking about, in my opinion. That is
mhm,
that's how that is. And then for me, once I got to the point where I started to get affirmation of things that I knew that you couldn't theoretically know,
mhm,
where I received information of, well, that's going to happen. Well, that's predicting the future, but I got the heads up information about that first.
mhm,
And then when I actually started really getting effective change and results, and then realizing that after I got to the level of what I think is reasonable competence. I won't say mastery. I'll never say mastery because I don't think that there's ever a point where you have nothing further to learn.
Mm-hmm.
But competence in being able to do the things for myself, then the next logical step is, well, how do I direct that towards another? Where this isn't just me, reading myself and my own future and solving my own health issues, but now I'm directing those abilities to work with another person. And it was just that one moment of, oh, I got it,
Mm-hmm.
like, well, I don't know, it's just, this is very, gee, I don't know. Well, gee, I'm gonna well, I think I picked up that, you're used to, work on a sailboat. And she's like, well, yes, I did.
Wow.
It works, it was that kind of a thing. So there was a real transition there. And I think when it comes to talking about psychic development or psychic work, it's usually that tipping point when a person is working with another person they do not know, that you call yourself a psychic. But
Mm-hmm.
I would say that everyone is actually already doing that to at least some degree.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that that's where it's more surprising is when there's somebody that you don't know anything about their life, and then you're picking
Total
up stuff.
stranger, never seen this person before. You sit down, you do your particular process, and they're wide-eyed,
Yeah.
or various things happen,
Right.
which I
Exactly.
know you know.
Yeah. Well, but it always shocks me every time. It's
Yeah,
just like, wow,
yeah,
okay, I guess it's
yeah.
real.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess, gosh, there's a couple of things that you had said. But one of the things was you had talked about like having people to kind of around you that are sort of doing like a cohort, or just
Hmm.
people around that are sort of doing the same practice. Because I'll just say for my own situation, like I am still involved in doing sort of the Western ceremonial magic, a lot of that. I like that it's very solitary. However, the thing I kept running into, because I did have like I still do have a little community of other practitioners, but man, I was just having all these like weird mystical things happening, like during meditation or whatever. And I'm like, hey,
Hmm.
this is happening. Anybody else? And either it wasn't happening or they felt weird about sharing it. Um, so yeah, so I was like, okay, well, I need to figure this out with a different group of people because they're not willing to talk about it or whatever. I don't know exactly what's going on. But I will say, when I do find or have found other people that are, either exploring the psychic thing or the mystical side, it has been so relieving. So I can just validate what you were kind of talking about in
Yeah.
our.
And I will say I find that to be one of the surprising joys that has
Mm,
come out for me working in the teaching and the organizing or more the leadership capacity in this field, where I have a group of individuals who come together and I give them exercises, I give them meaningful things to do, and
mhm,
then say, well, what did you find? What did you find? And every time they come back with these things that it shows the diverse array of results that an individual can get from doing the same exercise with the same intention.
mhm,
And it really has been revelatory to have people do exactly what you're talking about, to share, because it does show that people do have very different experiences, even when they attempt the same practice. And so it's not about having a particular experience, in my opinion, but
right.
rather the authentic experience it is to you.
Mhm,
And it can be quite marvelous and quite astonishing what people experience on a particular type of exercise or practice, but
mhm.
delightful.
Yeah. Is there an experience that one of your students shared with you that you feel led to share or
Yeah,
like?
really.
Mhm,
So I had a group going and I give them basically what would be almost like low-level channeling exercises to
mhm,
do, where I have them set aside anything that they think that they know and do what I call an original inquiry, which it's attention, essentially it's basically going directly into kind of the collective knowledge of all and bringing back information about something that you would not necessarily have any preconceived notion that it would happen. And I sent a couple of times, a couple of things come to mind. One in where I sent the group off and said, get a preview of what comes next. Once you're done with your life on Earth and you move on to whatever it is that we move on to, which is very debatable as to what that is. I don't think there's any one answer. I think there's many different things. Go take a peek. Go see what you find. And it was fascinating what people came back with. You know, we had one person who came back with like, well, it's like living in two dimensions at the same time. Like he's getting this information and he's having this sensory experience. It's a sort of like an intro level to like a projection of consciousness where you send a bit of your mind off. And it goes over there and it's like, well, it's literally like you're aware of being in two different things in the same level. That was one thing that he had there. And others have gone and come back with, you know, like changes in revisiting the earth and seeing it like in a transparent way. It's like you don't see the earth when you move on as like this physical realm. It's almost like it's part of like a flow of action. And they were coming back with stuff that I'd never had heard of or never thought of, you know, and that was what was fun about it. And realize, well, there's probably some truth to there. And is there a little bit of creativity and invention? There's probably a little bit of that there too. But it's fascinating that what people can come back with when they are, you know, really willing to just listen, just have that question, have that intention, and just listen or sense what comes to you without trying to make anything up. Amazing results.
So quick question on that, because I know because you mentioned about making it up and then something coming to you. How do you know which is which, I guess?
Also, very great question. And I think that to some extent there's a bit of a convolution here, because once you imagine something, I think it becomes real. A lot of this, in the way I approach it, is to be very clear on what the intent is. And to recognize that whatever the information is, it is translated back into an eidetic vocabulary that allows us to understand it. And so pure information exists beyond language. And so when we use what most people call the clairs, what most people call the inner senses, like they see something with their inner vision or they feel something physically, is to recognize that's not the pure original information. That's an attempt to translate it into something that you would understand. And in doing so, there is some creative effort there. But if you can feel behind that to what the pure meaning is, then you can actually understand that. Or attempt to understand what's really being communicated is not the image, it's the meaning behind the image. The other thing is I do truly recommend that people really learn and study and master, if they can, or at least gain competence on getting information from the inner abilities, inner senses, in a way that you can then affirm. So remote viewing is a fantastic one, because if you have to find some place that you don't know what it is that you're even looking for, and you're able to bring in accurate information, then you learn your own vocabulary. You learn how to distinguish between kind of good information that's coming in versus I'm just making this up because I'm desperate to get something and I don't want to come up empty-handed. Which some of that, frankly, is a matter of training. You know, if you're not reminded as a student that it's not about being right, and it's not even about getting anything at all, it's about listening. So if you can train on something where you can have someone affirm, even if it's learning to do eventually readings where you're describing information about someone that you do not know, they can then affirm back to you that, yes, that is accurate. And then it's, I think, a bit easier to make that distinction between the accurate information came to me this way, and then I had that after, versus I can tell when I'm kind of making it up, that kind of a thing. Yeah, because I think there is a distinction. Yeah.
So I know that you had described, sort of related. I have where I want this to go, but you had
Mhm.
described sort of seeing the code of the universe in
Mhm.
sort of like I think you said it was in a morning time, sort of like, was it at it's not hypnagogic, it's the other one. There's like hypnagogic is when you're
Yeah, so
falling
there's
asleep.
what most people,
Hypnopompic.
yeah, the standard no, name terminology is like in your, I call it the liminal state. So when
Mm,
I do dream interpretation and a little bit differently than what's typically out there, but there's that liminal state, both when you're falling asleep and coming out of a sleep, where you're not really in either. You're not fully focused out there in the world, but you're not really completely asleep either. You're sort of in this middle zone. And as you're falling asleep, the hypnagogic is that as you're coming awake, they call it the hypnopompic. But it's a fairly common occurrence for me as I'm falling asleep to transit through a liminal state and to maybe go lucid or maybe not. It can go either way. But as I'm falling asleep, sometimes what I'll see is abstract, like sheets, like what, like flowing sheets, like scrolling up of like old binary code, like green screen 01010000, and it just it's like a flowing sheet.
mhm,
And sometimes it can go into abstract color shaped symbols, but one of the things that is very common when I experience is that it either scrolls like on an old computer screen, or it changes really fast. It's
mhm,
kind of like pulsing very quickly. And my understanding of that is that as we are falling asleep, our consciousness is beginning to travel away from outer focus and travel inward. And as we pass through the layers of our own consciousness, we transit through what I'll just call the structural underpinnings of physical reality.
mhm,
And so we're having this experience where we're literally kind of moving through a middle zone here. And whatever you experience or see in a dreamlike state that seems physical is just a rendering or a translation of what's actually happening. And so flowing, scrolling sheets of green screen binary code is something that can only have happened in the 20th century or later.
mhm,
So it's really my mind's translation of what I will call very rudimentary substructures, very rudimentary forms, patterns, information. And because I don't need to really process all of that, I see it in its sort of symbolic, rudimentary form, like you would see binary code or just
mhm,
abstract shapes. And then it can go into deeper layers of sleep where you start to have more of what we think of as like the narrative dreams
mhm,
or the dream adventures. And I do remember because you had shared with me that you saw something similar, but it
mhm.
was more when you were waking up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that suggests it's possible. I don't claim to know everything about this, but as you were transiting back into physical focus, into physical
Mhm,
reality, you're once again passing through those layers, these kind of structural underpinnings, and they are like these rudimentary substructures, really like the source code of our own physical reality. If I often use in my classes the metaphor of a web page,
mhm,
and that the life that you're having is like one web page, but you have to render it by pulling open your device, right?
mhm,
But the web page is not really the source thing that creates it. It's that source code behind it that
mhm.
travels to your particular physical body. So,
Yeah. Very cool. I like the idea of it sort of being a transition sort of
mhm,
place. Um, so I'll just share. So the thing I saw very similar, but it was on like it initially appeared like it was on a scroll, like an old
mhm,
scroll. So to me, it was
mhm,
looking different. But then it had like the different codes, and they were switching, kind of like I call it like the
mhm.
Matrix code. It's like
Yeah,
doing that.
yeah.
Um, but I think because I was in that in between state and I didn't really, it felt like I was awake, but I wasn't, but I could tell it to do things. So I was like telling it to rotate, and then I could see like layers, and I call them Photoshop layers because I've used Photoshop. It's just like layers, and it went
Yeah,
down into
layers.
infinity. Yeah.
Yeah, layers of consciousness.
Hmm.
Absolutely. That's so beautiful because that tells me that your way of symbolic language, I think of like rudimentary source code as being old green screen binary code, but you went back even further. You went back to the ancient Dead Sea
I
Scrolls.
guess so. I was like, okay.
And what I love about this is you pointed out something that the liminal state is one of my favorite. People make such a big deal about the lucid state
Mm,
and what have you, but the liminal state is one of the most powerful because that's where you can suggest things to yourself and
mm,
actually generate dreams that give you information while you're in that liminal state if you can learn to hold it open. And
mm-hmm.
so, yes, you can actually give instructions to your dreaming consciousness to make things happen. And it's pretty fascinating what you can do.
Well, I guess to so it'll be sort of my last thing on that. But
Mhm.
so for me, I'm always like, what the heck? I'm always just in this state of like, the hey am I looking at? Like I'm just like shocked and always very amused.
Mhm.
So is there a way for me to like, I guess consciously now I can try to remember to, you know, do some my own programming in that state if it happens
Mhm.
again. I'm sure it'll happen again. But
Mhm.
like, do you have a technique for that? Like, you know?
Oh, for kind of riding the liminal state.
Yeah, or like when to know that you're in it and then go, oh yeah, now I need to do that thing where I need to program.
Yeah, it's almost as tricky as holding the lucid state, which I actually find a little bit trickier, but I like the liminal state better. So I have stayed more with that. So my tip that I would give individuals is that one, don't try to come out of it.
Mm,
In fact, don't try to think with your logical mind or observe. So, one of the things that snaps consciousness out of experience is instead of experiencing, it tries to separate itself and observe. So, maybe you or your listeners have had this experience, or you do a meditation, or you're visualizing something, and sometimes you're first person and sometimes you're third person, right?
hmm.
Okay. So there's a really powerful difference between the first person and the third person. As you are in first person, you're actually creating that experience and having it. When you snap into the observer role, then you're actually attempting to separate yourself from that activity and that action and that actually can pull you out of it because
Mm,
now you're watching rather than doing. So
hmm.
one is to not attempt to, it's very delicate, it's a finite little balance here, but do not attempt to observe what's happening or logically process it. Just tell yourself, I want this, I'm doing that,
Mm.
and then just let it happen without trying to logically examine it.
Cool.
Mhm.
I'll try to remember to do that for sure. Because I'm always just like laughing at it, like, what the heck? This is hilarious.
Yeah, it's a neat state to ride. I can't. Well, maybe we'll have
Yeah.
another podcast episode, and you can update
Yeah.
everyone on your liminal adventures.
Yeah. I like that too, because I found when I was a kid, I was very much into lucid dreaming. I could do it very easily, but as an
Yeah,
adult, I really can't. But liminal states, like at least in the recent years, are like psh, 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 all the
yeah,
time. So
yeah. That's good. Well, then that's just the right thing for you to go with.
yeah, go
Yeah,
with that. Yeah.
yeah.
So we're kind of wrapping up here.
Mhm.
Do you have, so if you would like to leave our listeners with either a mantra or a motto that that serves you very well, that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do have one that I've had for a while. I wouldn't call it a mantra,
Mhm.
but I would call it a principle that I remind myself of. It's just work through it. There's always a way.
Hmm.
Yeah, whatever difficulty, problem, thing that doesn't seem like it's going to work out, just work through it
Mhm.
and know that there's always a way.
Cool. I like that. Very direct and easy to remember. I like that. So I know, gosh, I know that you do so much. But what is your current area of focus that you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am teaching. So I teach remote viewing, tarot. Got that tomorrow. And let's see, I do teach belief work. I have some classes and workshops I teach on belief work and absolutely purposeful dreaming and interpretation. So I do some free monthly drop-in discussion groups. And I also am offering one-on-one sessions in healing. And those are very instructional format where I really look to give that person tools that they can take away and work at home and be effective on promoting their own well-being, even without, the expert ministrations of healers such as yourself. So, yeah.
Uh, um, Thank you for that. Do you have some contact information that you would like to share as well?
You can look at a lot of my offerings in the Seattle area, the Expanded Mind group at meetup.com. So you can just go on to meetup.com and look for Seattle area dream classes, dream events, or tarot, or what have you. Also, my website is just my name, emmadevan.com. So you can find some links to my offerings there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, for being my guest and sharing all the wonderful information that you have. And take care.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
That was an interview with Emma Devan, where we discussed her spiritual journey and expert teaching experience with remote viewing and working with trance states. Visit emmadevan.com to learn more about her and her practice. And if you are in the Seattle area, you can check out her meetup.com Expanded Mind group. To learn more about the Casual Temple podcast, please visit our website, casualtemple.com. There's a Casual Temple YouTube channel, and you can follow me on Instagram with username @MarileeDuffy or @CasualTemple. Please be sure to leave a review and share this episode with the people in your life who would enjoy this content. Do check out the other episodes of the Casual Temple podcast on your preferred podcast app, and thank you so much for listening.